So we're kind of unrolling a new painting today. And BC, you're going to film this, right? Am I okay mic-wise? So what we're talking about today is the Civil War in the Shoals. I've got Greg Gresham with me today. He's forgotten more than I know. So is Dr. Ott here. So my job is to be kind of a gatekeeper to you guys and explain some of what we're doing with Civil War trails, a little bit about what happened here, but then really be a kind of a gateway to, if you're interested in history in this area, resources and things that you can use to find more out. So it's really nice. The library staff really appreciate y'all having us here and getting the presentation in at the last minute. That's great. I moved here about 3 years ago. I'm from the Shoals originally. I left here when I was about 5 and then moved back about 3 years ago. Passionate about the area, certainly passionate about history. So for me, it's been great fun being back and kind of meeting my people, people that are interested in history and local history especially. And there's so much that happened here. It's really fascinating. And then Dr. Ott, my neighbor, was one of the first people I met. So during COVID, we would sit on the front porch and get to talk history. So I was in heaven when we got here. We're going to kind of talk about current state of affairs, tourism, Civil War in the Shoals, and then how we're telling the story. I got more information today. So it's really pretty interesting the way this is happening. I've been using this slide since I started writing books on the Civil War. I know this face. This is Larry David's little Facebook meme. He says, an avid history buff, Larry David took his daughter to every one of the Civil War battlefields for family vacation. Hey guys, how are you? So that's what I did with my kids. I drug them around to the battlefields. They were bored out of their minds. You either get the gene to be into history or you don't. My brother has a history degree and could care less about history. But I love it, and I don't know why. As I'm sure you probably don't know. If you're here tonight, you either were drugged here by your relative or friend that has the gene. But that is what I'm kind of used to. I couldn't get my kids interested in history, so I felt like I was fighting Harry Potter all the time. Great writer, I mean, really significant work, and certainly made a little more money than I have as a writer. But I was really trying to get my kids out of that fantasy genre and into history. And my answer was to write books about it. I lived on the road, and I had a lot of experience growing up. I was a Civil War reenactor as a young man. My armor unit based in Aniana, I was in the Army National Guard through college. On weekends, we would run tanks, and then the next weekend, we would go do Civil War reenacting. So at about that age of imprint, I was living with a foot in both the real Army of today with real-world missions, and I was living in that Civil War reenacting, and it gave me the feeling and knowledge of what it's like to be a young man in the military, and I felt like I could translate that into my writing. This is my ancestor, Lewis Nix. He was a North Mississippi guy, ended up settling here, couldn't read or write, just hardscrabble farmers. That's all my people really were. But I knew all these stories throughout my childhood, this oral history, and that's really what led me to write Freedom Spring and Confederate Winter. And I'll tell you a little bit about the story of that. I didn't put a lot in on the books today because we're really kind of talking about art and some of the resources around. But Confederate Winter came from those stories that we had. And I felt like because my ancestor had been drafted in the Confederate Army at the age of 14, and we had those family stories, that was a story that might resonate with my kids. And so I was an on-the-road salesman, and I wrote that by not watching television. I didn't watch TV for about a year and a half on the road, every night I would sit down and I knew the history and I knew what was going on. And so in Hood's campaign in 1864, kind of starting here, that's where that book came from. And then I was doing a presentation one evening at the Florence Adult Learning Center associated with UNA, and from that met Peggy Towns, whose young ancestor, African American, from Athens, was drafted in the Union Army or recruited into the Union Army in the USCT. And that story really resonated with me. So the next, I guess the second book in the triad was about an African American soldier from this area fighting on the other side. And I always tell people, read them both. I like Confederate Winter first, but Freedom Spring is my favorite book. But it will give you an idea of kind of what it was like in those days living. So this area, we'll get into a little more of the specifics, but there is a lot of tourism around the shoals. I do Civil War character reenacting for the riverboats at Pope's Tavern sometimes. And the way I navigate around not being a Confederate or a Union is I go as a war correspondent. So I'll sit on the front porch there at Pope's Tavern and sign books and do living history with the folks coming in. And I kind of see the people that are interested in history or the ones that are here for, they just got drugged on the cruise. There's a lot of people really interested in that period. But there's certainly a lot of tourism around music heritage, and the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area, that's one of their key planks is music heritage. The Indian Mound, I have breakfast every Friday morning with Calvin Durham, the guy that is the architect that built the Indian Mound Museum. What an amazing piece of scholarship we have here, and reference to our history in that Indian Mound. And then I think people come, and certainly with a lot of the events that we have around the Indian heritage we have here, that's an important place. My wife and I visit Frank Lloyd Wright properties whenever we travel. To have the only one in the state of Alabama is significant. I mean, we're really blessed, and if you hadn't been out there lately, I really encourage you to go. It's a phenomenal place. We're kind of a charming river city. I like to bring my buddies down here playing golf. We have huge fishing opportunities, but a lot of times, and then Pope's Tavern, and then lastly on this is the MSNHA Civil War Trail. Now that region encompasses Decatur, Athens, and over to the Mississippi line. And this area we'll talk about in a minute was kind of no man's land. So for Civil War heritage and history, we have an opportunity to explain what it was like in a real divided area. Most of the Civil War battlefields in Virginia, for example, that most people kind of think of in that genre, that was very kind of binary. You were either for the South or for the North. This area was very divided, didn't want us to secede, was very resistant to it, had a lot of Northern sympathizers throughout the war. So there's once again, and we also had a significant number of USCT troops pulled from here. So that also gives us another dimension to the narrative around the shoals. So I feel, and a lot of others feel, that we have quite a bit to offer. Now we do have a Civil War trail in the state of Alabama. I've seen the flyers. This is from the official map. We have on here Pope's Tavern, and there's a little bit on Straight's Raid, if you're familiar with that, that came through. But tying it together, we really haven't done as well as we think we can, and so that's an opportunity that we have in this Civil War Trails. Tennessee does a great job. If you get on the Civil War Trails map in Tennessee, you can track that through, and a lot of people do it. I've been through it down Virginia's, does a great job. So once again, a lot of opportunity to do, kind of tell the story about this time period. Let's see, I'm going to see if I can figure out how to do this next part. Here we go. Let's go to this map. So this was, let's talk a little bit about the logistics of the Civil War. some of my graphics aren't going to show up in this side of the presentation, but the Mississippi River and Grant's campaign down to Vicksburg began to split the Confederacy in half. So a lot of the Confederacy was lost in '63 after Vicksburg fell. And then that's the same time around up in the northern part that we had the Battle of Gettysburg. And so there's a lot happening in this kind of angle up into the Union. Nashville fell pretty quickly. If you look at the river system is like a dagger down into the heart of the Confederacy. It didn't take long for these two forts up here, Donaldson and Henry, to fall. And when they fell, it just opened up this whole swath. Now remember, East Tennessee was very Union. That area really did not want to secede. Northern Alabama, Winston County, a lot of this area up here, southern Tennessee, once again was very pro-Union. And until Lincoln's call for the 75,000 volunteers, most of those people were really not thinking secession. There is cotton grown there, but it's not predominant like it was down here. And we were talking at the round table not long ago and about how just on in the flatland up here where cotton was grown, those people tended to be pro-slavery and pro-secession. But as you got into the hillier country north of Florence, that was typically pro-Union. And so places like Florence were very divided in that. And then because the river gave a natural defensive line attaching really to the mountain chain there, you could defend this with cavalry. You weren't really defending the north side of the river that much, but Roddy's cavalry and kind of smaller detachments that were sent over could delay incursions, while the main armies pushed down through Mississippi, Corinth, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and then in the Eastern Theater, and then eventually down into straight into the heart of the Confederacy, into Atlanta. All right, bear with me. Let's see how this... Oh, I know what's happening. These slides are moving.
There you go. Yeah.
Here we go. Okay. Now the other thing that, if you go back to this map, the other thing that we kind of share, or that makes this area so interesting, are the Muscle Shoals. There's a band and the best map of it is in New Albany, Indiana. There's a band of ancient rock that runs underneath the landscape here that makes it hard for these rivers to erode. So the Falls of the Ohio is the same geologic formation. Nashville and Cumberland, that break in the river there, the end of navigation, and then the Muscle Shoals all have this event or this geologic reason that you can navigate down to that point, and then you can't go farther. Now you could get some transportation, but the main transportation ended at Muscle Shoals, just as it ended around Nashville, and in the old days before the dam system would end at New Albany at the Falls of the Ohio. But what that gave us, and there's a great picture of the Muscle Shoals and what they used to look like before navigation. What it did was provide a natural defensive barrier for the Confederates. So around Tuscumbia, Florence, and the natural barrier of the shoals, the natural barrier of that wide river, gave North Alabama a little bit of a break. The raids down into that were real organized raids. Straits raids, for example, came at the expense of a lot of casualties. So that, again, was something that created a little bit of I guess, safety here in the shoals. So let's go to 1862, and we'll talk a little bit about the first visit of the Union after secession. The U.S. in February of 1862, we're not going to go through every one of these, but I want to give you more than anything a little bit of the flavor of what's happening. The gunboats. So you're in Florence, you've got your gunboats or your commerce in the stores, and everything is happening. You're living your life. The country is seceded. You're trying to figure out what it's going to look like, but you haven't really seen what it means to be at war here in the Shoals area. And all of a sudden, chugging down the river come these two gunboats, and they're menacing. They're big, and they've got cannon on them, and they're the Confederates are like, what in the world are we going to do? All of a sudden, because the cannon you can mount on those gunboats, those platforms, are so much stronger that we can pull by horses in kind of the infantry, cavalry, artillery triad of land forces. So the Confederates burn the bridge into Florence. Imagine what that does with your commerce. Like my parents live on this side of the river, we live on the Florence. If you've got to take a boat across, a rowboat across the river to get the family, that's a significant event. Commerce begins to shut down. A lot of implications behind that. The Confederates end up burning a lot of the, I think 3 riverboats or 4 at the, I look to Greg a lot because he's really my subject expert. But they burn the boats at the landing. And then by June, Union troops are here. And this is the story where Reverend Mitchell was arrested in the pulpit, basically, on a Sunday morning, doing a fiery anti-union speech or sermon from the pulpit, and they arrested him and sent him up north to a prison camp. So that's when this happens. And then there's some skirmishes around as it's a hard place to defend because you can get around behind it. There's a lot of Confederate cavalry around. They're not huge numbers of Union troops. They're not an occupying army necessarily here. They're more of kind of smaller detachments. So a lot of action and a lot of real scary propositions for the local populace here. I think one of these days, the gunboat battle we're going to show today is probably the most dramatic, but I do think that there might be something in the art to tell the story of that first contact. So 63, lots going on. This is the year of Gettysburg. This is the year of Vicksburg Falls. This is the year of Straits Raid. We studied this in school, in elementary school, in my generation. I don't know that kids in Alabama study this anymore. But Emma Sampson and those stories, if you grew up born when I did, this was a very kind of the main part of Alabama Civil War history that you learned. Straits Raid was what I was talking about with these organized raids, that there was Confederate presence all around south of the river, and what the goal is always to get behind an army and cut off their supply line. That's just a tenet of military tactics and strategy, is cut off supply. So Colonel Abel Strait and a Union force mounted mostly on mules moved down across northern Alabama, pursued by Forrest, ended up in his capture. Dramatic story that I won't go into, but there was a lot of action around the shoals because in 1863 is when Union General Corwin begins to raid into Florence and actually really start the destruction. So the mills are burned out on Cypress Creek. There's engagement in Tuscumbia. There's a lot of, up until 1863, you could still kind of have your property and function, but after 1863, it begins to change in the shoals. At this point, I'll read you this quote. The deprivations of the soldiers at this point was pretty rough. In Vicksburg, they were, by the time the Confederates surrendered, they were eating rats. The challenge as a soldier was pretty intense. And so, and also by this time, as in 1863, as the armies kind of went through and cleaned out the areas of food and forage, you began to get letters like this from home. This is a letter from a lady here, a wife here in the shoals, to her husband in the Confederate Army. I would not have you do anything wrong for the world, but before God, Edward, unless you come home, we must die. Last night I was aroused by little Eddie's crying. I called and said, "What's the matter, Eddie?" And he said, "Oh, Mama, I'm so hungry." And Lucy, Edward, your darling Lucy, she never complains, but she is growing thinner and thinner every day. And before God, Edward, unless you come home, we must die. So imagine being up here in Bragg's army in Tullahoma, and you get that kind of letter from your wife, and you're really only 2 or 3 days walk back down to the shoals, we began to get a lot of deserters and people coming back to the shoals. So that also then provided kind of that lawless nature that you read about in the Booker Chronicles. There was a lot of this really kind of begins in 1863. We've got a great historian named Lanny Perry. I can't wait to paint this battle. I had ancestors that fought in this. One of them is actually buried on the battlefield. Just to give you some idea of where the Battle of Little Bear Creek is in 1863, Tuscumbia is right about here, to give you an idea. So not far outside of Tuscumbia on Little Bear Creek, south of the river, was a pretty significant Civil War battle that I'm going to bet most people in the area have no idea happened. I don't think there's a marker out on 72, anything about that. So that to me is part of where we begin to tell the story of what happened here. But once again, cavalry mostly, an incursion in by the Union, defense by the local troops and the Confederates that are trying to hold on to the area. Bye guys. You want to see the painting real quick? Let me turn around before you go. These are some of my grad student colleagues. There you go. Yeah, go take a look if you want real quick. It's better to see it up close.
That's incredible. Thank you. Sorry it's a lever.
Hey, no worries. So, 1864, we live in a house on Wood Avenue that is called the Negley House. And General Negley was one of the first people into Florence, and people fell in love with it. It's a great, charming little town, and the area was great. So this was a quote from a guy from the 9th Ohio. Florence is a nicely located town with beautiful residences, and I love this part, and I would say handsome feminines. Because soldiers are always looking at girls. That's what we try to do mostly. But there was in 1864, once again, still a lot of deprivation, a lot of challenges, a lot of action around here. And then as Hood's army comes in, they've been defeated in Atlanta. They're trying to figure out what to do. And the plan Hood comes up with is to leave Atlanta. He tries to break Sherman's supply line, and they try to take Decatur and cross the river. They end up coming to Tuscumbia, crossing the river, and then that ends up in the battles of Franklin and Nashville, which hopefully you'll read about in Freedom Spring or Confederate Winter. That will give you, but our aspect in that period of time is what led to this painting, which we'll kind of begin to talk about a little bit. So you're kind of set up, it's winter months, but it was like about 60 degrees, and we're going to start with this one. So Hood goes up, he's defeated, and it's really a disaster at the Battle of Nashville and Franklin. It's a disaster. And he retreats. This is Bainbridge Crossing right here, and that painting is the middle one here. And as he's retreating, he gets down to the shoals, and they're trapped with their backs against the river. And the guy who's done really the research on this, that really, and he'll be writing a book soon in it, is Greg Gresham.
So, thanks, Kurt, for the introduction. Kurt's really kind. I got interested in doing this. I retired about 5.5 years ago. I was very fortunate. Primarily, I wanted to retire because we knew grandkids were coming, and I didn't want a job to hold me down. My kids live off different places. Second reason, I like to play golf, and golf is a very consuming thing. I don't know if we got any golfers out there. And the third thing, you got to fill your time up. And I said, well, I'll start doing research local history. And one of the things I came across, and I'll just read it real quick, was a guy named, his name was George Brewer. He was a captain in the 46th Alabama. And he wrote something in the history, and I was kind of looking at it because I was kind of interested in Hood's campaign. I wanted to find out what happened here. And he said, an occurrence of thrilling interest awaited us when the Tennessee River was reached above Florence, Alabama. The stream had been swollen by the rains that had been falling. It was difficult to lay the pontoon bridge across the broad, rapid stream. It was about finished when a gunboat of the enemy steamed up near it and began shelling us. A few of our guns were put in position, opened up on the vessel, and sharpshooters were trying to pick off our men. But one thought filled our minds, and that was that the daring commander would run through our pontoon bridge, cut the ropes, and let the boats float away, and we would have no options but to surrender. The feat was easy and the price cheap for the capture of the Army of Tennessee, even if it cost the loss of the gunboat, the armament, and the crew. But the commander let his opportunity pass and soon put himself out of range by steaming back down the river. And when you read that, it's a pretty profound couple of sentences there strung together, and you're sitting there going, wow, that happened here? I never heard about that. And so then I started, it's been a 5-year quest to this point, understand what exactly happened here. And the nice thing about paintings is pictures tell 1,000 words, and this one does. If a gunboat is this close to a bridge, and that bridge is bowed, you can see how bowed it is. All these guys talked about when they were walking across that pontoon bridge, how scared they were. And the fall of the Muscle Shoals, when you're walking on it, it's not a waterfall. But when you look in the distance and you see that water coming down, it looks like a waterfall. And it's roaring at you. So these guys have all these experiences about crossing this bridge. This bridge is a fragile thing. And when you hear about gunboats turning around when they have an opportunity to blow a bridge up, it don't sound like what Farragut said at Mobile Bay, which was down the torpedoes full speed ahead. So that's why I got interested in looking into this. And so it's a fascinating story. I've told Kurt about it. And the thing is, it's the story that don't quit giving. So every time I think I've got it to where I can figure it out and everything else, I find out I found something else. And so it continues to go on. But I think I've got it kind of put together. And so that happened on one day. I think I understand why Admiral Lee decided, and we had an admiral, there was a United States admiral in this first boat, and he decides to turn around.
Now this is the end of the Byler Road. The Byler Road runs from the Natchez Trace all the way down to Tuscaloosa. So this painting is Tuscaloosa in 1824, and you can see the Capitol being built here. So when you come up and look at the paintings afterwards, that's where this is. This gave me confidence. I'd only done a couple of acrylics before. This may be 4th or 5th painting I'd done that was not watercolor. That one gave me a lot of confidence that I might be able to take this next picture that Greg's teaching me about and do something with it, because I was a little nervous in going into this one. So we'll come back to this slide. Let's go to this one.
So the next day after this one, and see, a year ago I would have told you this happened first. Because there's historians that say this occurred before that occurred. That's not what happened. And then after I started reading things, I got some Union gunboat logs. And if you can get information as close to the time period as possible, you don't get confused by these accounts that are years later. And then things started making sense. There was newspaper accounts that didn't make sense. There's Confederate eyewitness accounts that nothing ever jived. And so this happened the next day. This happened on December 27th, 1864. And this is the USS Neosho. And what's interesting about this boat is there's only 2 built like her. It was designed specifically so that it could float in very shallow waters. Designed specifically to be able to go up on something as shallow as the most shoals. And after they destroyed these batteries that were located here, right at the railroad bridge piers, these two, and they left that one alone for whatever reason. He turned around. Didn't go up. He blamed it on the pilot, and he blamed it on some fog, but he didn't take the chance. Now, there's a lot of stuff here that I can't get into right now, but just because I could sit here and talk about it for the next 2 hours. But I worked in corporate America a lot of years. And if I was teaching a business writing skills, I'd use Admiral Lee's report, after action report, to explain what occurred, because it's very accurate. And you're also saying, we need to give that guy a promotion. And that's just the way people write, that end up advancing. They write in a very skillful way. It's always accurate, but it always gives the best side of the story. And that's what he did. Now, this guy's a good guy. Don't get me wrong, but he's talented. But 30 years later, he's still haunted by what didn't happen here. He feels like he should have blown that bridge up. And he actually writes engineers that's working on the Muscat's Canal to explain to him the science behind the Muscat's. And he actually writes a defense for his actions here that nobody's really ever published or put out. So that's what I'm planning on doing, is get to that point. It's like I said, it's been an all-consuming thing, and during this time that I've done this research, what you find out is there's just a whole lot of stuff here that occurred that just gets buried with time. So,
Well, and the thing that, before you leave, the thing that matters in this is that small, and this is what I always told my kids, small actions by normal people matter.
yep.
So in this, now granted, Admiral Lee, who is, by the way, a cousin of Robert E. Lee. You ever heard of Robert E. Lee? Kind of a famous guy. If he, on this front gunboat, takes a little bit more of a chance and breaks that bridge, then this area is like Appomattox or Vicksburg. There's an entire army that surrenders here on the north side of the river. People would think of the shoals as they did Vicksburg and Appomattox. But because he didn't break the bridge, Hood was able to escape. Well, a lot of that comes down to the fact that, tell them real quick the story about the pilot.
The pilot, when I gave a presentation to the Alabama Historical Association last year, and the pilot, this boat was really famous at the battle around Nashville. A few days it broke Confederate siege, and the pilot, actually a civilian pilot, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, one of only 4 civilians to get that award. Well, apparently it looks like from documentation and stuff that he is the pilot, but I couldn't prove that. So my last slide was saying this pilot declined on going on the Muscle shows, but I don't know if it's really him or not. I'm still digging for that information, trying to find that out. And later I found out it's not him. He actually had suffered some physical damage during that event at Nashville at Bell's Bend. And so it was somebody else. So who is it? I had given up. I thought I would find. So the gunboat log, I got those from Washington, D.C. And all of a sudden there's this guy named Smith. So you're sitting there going, I've got a guy named Smith. I couldn't get a Wojciechowski or somebody like that. I get a Smith. So I'm sitting there going, I'll never figure out who he is. And it just so happened, you're scouring over these books, and I don't read books. I told him, I said, I apologize. College ruined me. I got an engineering degree. I didn't have time to read the book. I had to just go through it and find what I needed to find, and that's how I do research, do the same thing. And I went and looked at this one book. It's not even written about this area, and a guy mentions this pilot. His name is Smith. And then I looked over and I said, well, hey, it's the same guy, that the law book said. So I'm sitting there looking at it, and well, he's got a source. He's got some information. So I go to that source, and when I get to the source, there's this wealth of information. There's 70 pages on what people said about this guy, about his life, about everything about him. So that became fascinating. But the one key thing is, the girl said, one of the ladies said, he was my neighbor in Chickasaw, Alabama, before the war. He lives in Chickasaw. Where does that lead you? And I said, well, I'll go look at the census, just see what the heck, verify that. And so sure enough, he's in the census. And as I'm going looking at the census record, they number the families. I don't know if any of y'all looks at that. So it's 233, 234. He's family 235. Family 233 is a guy named Philip Dale Roddy. Now, Philip Dale Roddy was General Roddy of the Confederate Service, but so he's got neighbors that...
He was the guy in North
Yeah.
Alabama.
So
Roddy was, they call him the defender of North Alabama.
So it's really interesting. Yeah.
North Alabama,
Yeah. So it's what's really interesting is this Smith, I know for sure he was on that boat that day. And I know Lee was on that boat. This day, I know Lee was in this boat, but there's two tin clads. These same two boats here, they're back here. They're not even engaged because there's no reason. These guys are going to knock this out. We don't have to be engaged. And they're back here, and it appears that pilot was back here. So I don't know which pilot made that decision, but in my mind, it leads to all kinds of conflicts for this guy. You think about when you look at this painting here, and you're going to, as just a human being, and you're going to shoot that boat, and it's got people that bridge, and it's got people all on it, and you're going to break it, stuff like that. Some of these people may be your relatives, they may be your neighbors. There's got to be a huge conflict for everybody, and that's what the Civil War is. When you get down to it, there's these conflicts that go on, and these paintings kind of tell that story. And hopefully I get to tell that in a book if I can figure out how to write it. So that's the story. Probably more than you ever wanted to hear, but that's it.
Did the record say that the reindeer and the ferry were actually there, or did it insinuate?
Yeah. He talks about he made a reconnaissance on the shows. He never specifically says, I saw the bridge. The guy that's the commander of this battery here, that's the only count I've got of them talking about that battery, but it's just very fortunate that he wrote something. He specifically says before they fired that they turned. And when they turned, there's only one reason to turn, that's to fire a broadside at the bridge. And he fired on the boats at that time. So I don't understand, but in my mind, the only thing I can figure is Lee knew he had this, and he didn't bring it up with him. He left this boat at Waterloo, and because he left that boat at Waterloo, he didn't have it up with him on the shows. And there's other things, there's technical things to talk about. There's a whole lot of science, which, I don't like dealing with science, but I can. That's what engineers do. And I could talk, but I'm going to have to talk about science in the boat, in the book. And I'm also going to have to talk about the science related to this ship, because even though it was specifically designed like this, it had to be towed a lot of places just because the maneuverability wasn't very good. So,
Thanks, Greg.
any other questions? Thanks.
It's been great fun working on these. Part of the challenge in history is that a lot of it's dry. You can kind of see as I'm going through the narrative, you can feel, I can see people's eyes glaze as we go through dates and times and events. And I study this, as does Greg, and we get confused. And so it's really a challenge, and that's why there are certain things that bring it alive for us. I think the paintings do. I think it ties it together. I'm hoping to give a voice to the historians as my contribution to kind of local history. But we have some amazing resources. If you're going to take a picture of a slide, this is the one to do. There's a guy named Jordan Collier at the Florence Public Library, and he's got a podcast on called Historical Insights. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. and he's not finished. He's only on 1864 right now, but he's an interesting guy who does great research. His take is pretty much only from the Union sources and narratives in the official records. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, he's all official records.
All official records.
Yeah, pretty much.
The other thing that he's done, I don't know that anybody's ever done this for their area. After the war, there was, years after the war, maybe 10 years after the war, there was the ability of the federal government said, we will reimburse you if you have a claim from the war. Well, Jordan's been through these two counties at least and analyzed every single record and submission and categorized it and built statistical databases out of it. And so he can verify a lot of times what's in the reports and bring it out. So that sounds, again, really dry, but he's a great storyteller. That is a podcast that's worth listening to. The Parks Department under Brian Murphy is doing some great stuff at Pope's Tavern right now. There's an archaeology club. We just dug up an old cistern made of bricks in the back that's really pretty cool. But I encourage you to look at the Parks Department. That also includes the Indian Mound and the Frank Lloyd Wright House. But I've donated some pieces in there. I've donated the artwork in here. We're starting to, I'm hoping eventually in the back of Pope's Tavern, there'll be a set of paintings and narratives that can take a person through this journey of what happened year by year with art and the story and really help it make sense. Okay? The Civil War Roundtable, we meet on the third Tuesday at 6 in Tuscumbia at Helen Keller Library. It is the greatest group of people. When I moved here, it was in COVID. We were all sitting 6 feet apart. But I've made some great friends that are really supportive of my work. That's where I met Greg. They're just really terrific folks. David Gregg is a regular speaker. There's tremendous, and we lose people. I was real nervous when I started this. I was talking to Greg, and I said, you know, everybody that's doing this is older. And he said, Kurt, but when we came in, we were the young people. There was another generation before us. People retire and they come in and they join it and they get interested. So the hope is, like Richard Sherman we lost this year, but Greg got a lot of his data and his tutelage. And so, but this is a great repository, and we're being discovered or used now by the national, or the heritage area in that. And then lastly, the gentleman in the back who's going to be at the speaker's pulpit on Sunday, BC, is speaking at 2 o'clock at the Helen Keller Library. He's got the North Alabama Local History Channel. And this guy, I can't speak enough about BC. Volunteers his time. He comes out, films. He's got 1,000 subscribers, films all kind of stuff. You want to see Harry Wallace? Go to North Alabama Local History. He's got videos of everything. And it's not all history. Some of it is, he may do 15 seconds and that you can pause of a historical marker in Cherokee that we'll never get out to see, but BC does it. Great. These 4 local resources in the history world are just, to me, they're just perfect. They're really terrific.
So now we need is an archives.
We need an archives.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the hope, an archives, and that's kind of what we're thinking about right now in the National Heritage and Pope's Tavern. And, you know, there's a lot in this story. So there's a lot happening that's really positive. And the goal is that we can make a story of it that gets people excited. Now, my place is art in it, but my real place is getting young people involved and interested. I'm of the opinion there's a point for all of us history nerds where all we want to read is nonfiction. But you don't start there. You start when you're 11 or 12 and you read history. So that's what I try to write in these books. So if you've got grandkids or kids or people in your life that are young people, and especially libraries, you know, if you can get them to read history, you won't get them all. 80% of them will be my brother. But you'll get that 10% that are history people that keep these things alive And that's who I wrote these for. So if you do get a book, I get a lot of adult readers, but that's really who it is. So I do sell the books. I do sell the prints. The new print, I'm really tickled. I've already had 10 people order the Florence gunboat battle. There's Giclée prints, and they look. The second one is actually not the original. That's a print, and to me it looks as good as the original. I could put them side by side; you couldn't tell. Wow. At Pope's Tavern and at the I donate paintings and books to the libraries, and when I donated it, the first thing Brian Murphy said is, "Thanks for making a small painting." He said, "Everybody wants to paint big for us. There's no room on the wall." So I know that these are small pieces to the story, and hopefully might be something, if you're a history nerd, that like me, they might be something that are interesting on your wall. Questions? And I got Greg with me, so you can ask anything.
I would ask, what's your intentions of a series? Do you have anything planned?
It's a great question. So I met today with Dr. Crawford from UNA, who is the person, and Jordan, who's the person at the National Heritage area. And what they want to do is taking Greg's work and Lanny's work, some of the work these guys have done, and they're gonna now tell me what they need on the next painting. So the next one I think is probably going to be Wilson's Cavalry Camp out in Gravelly Springs. As Jordan said, if I've got to use the same Matthew Brady picture, that every other kiosk is on, we're not going to get people out there. But the National Park Service has got a significant grant up that may fund this. And using local artists and local historians is what they want. They want to grow this here. I was talking about you in the meeting today. I said, because this guy right here is the most talented artist you can imagine. Actually, we've got two of them right here. Martha Carpenter is probably the most talented portrait artist I've ever seen. And I know everything. Martha's really great. But the point is, it's not just my work. My role is to find people that can make art that tells the story, and that's local, because that's what matters. So probably Gravelly Springs. I don't know, Greg. What do you think? I'm thinking Shoal Creek, but we do have to expand to Athens and Decatur. Yeah. Fort Henderson for sure, but because the story of Fort Henderson that you'll read about in Freedom Spring, I think is really the most compelling story here. To go from slavery to all of a sudden in uniform, and to being captured, and then sent down to Mobile to build fortifications, and then those fortifications assaulted by African American troops and captured. The arc of that story is made for novelists. I couldn't have fallen into a better story. And those are people from here.
Got a couple that I was wondering about, or as a Florence enthusiast, I guess you would say.
Yes, sir.
Is the battles that and the instances that had happened. One was the Conestoga and the Lexington chasing the Dunbar up Cypress Creek.
Right.
I'd love to see something about that.
I think that's on our list.
There ought to be two there. There's one that it's just being sunk in the creek, being at the creek, right? And we got a narrative by a guy who I think was actually the captain of the Dunbar who explained what occurred. It was in the Huntsville paper. But the other part of it is a year later, it's ferrying troops over at Bainbridge Ferry, that same place where that pontoon bridge is. Okay? Now, I had a good friend of mine, some of y'all might know Stuart McGregor. He's up here from time to time. But Stuart told me his mom swore that she went over that bridge when she was a child and she could see those gun whales sitting in the thing. But I've got narratives that say that the gunboat, I know for a fact the gunboat was raised and taken up. So some of what you want to do is, for lack of a better term, fix legends, get them kind of right. And another one, the great one, is lashing the pontoon bridge when they crossed into Florence on the railroad pier. I mean, you see that all the time. As an engineer, I was sitting there going, how'd they do that? That don't make any sense, and then I found things, they actually crossed over to the island and then built a trestle bridge, so that's not right. So there's a lot of art that goes to, there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, thrilling scenes that for anybody who likes to paint military art. And we're not talking about battle scenes. I think we might end up with one or two.
Right.
A lot of scenes are just a line of cavalry crossing the shoals, single file, in a zigzag pattern that stretches a mile because they can't go off the sides. If they do, they're gonna go downstream because of the current.
Something
So,
like that was my other one, is the White Horse Soldiers in the Peters
yeah, Ninth
Plantation.
Ohio Cavalry, yeah. That's another one. There's plenty of art for people interested in doing it. I can supply the words because you can write books ad nauseum, and for a lot of people, the imagination's not there, but an artist with a mind seeing stuff, they can really show a story, really can.
Yes, ma'am.
I apologize for being so late. I very stupidly wrote in my book, The City Hall.
Oh, no.
I know, and I told 2 or 3 people at school yesterday to come to the library, so. Anyway, and you probably talked about this earlier, is there any planned maintenance, or does anybody try to maintain those Confederate emplacements that are sitting up on the hill there above where South Florence was?
Not to my knowledge.
I'm
Greg, do
surprised
you?
that they're in the shape as they are.
Yeah, one of the projects can be, as this thing grows, one of the projects could be is you could do a living history thing at that site where you put the head logs there. They would have had a head log at the top. You could actually make them look a little bit like what they were, but that would be down the road. But I would love to have something like that. I think it would be interesting for people to see.
Mhm.